Hello, Professor. Good morning or early afternoon. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I had a little bit of problem finding the commentary 7 question. Do you know what PowerPoint slide it's on?
Yeah, that would be what we had last week. So that would be on the Heart Sutra.
Oh, okay. I was actually just looking over that PowerPoint right now, the metacognition. Very interesting.
Pretty heavy stuff.
Yes, it is. So,
Hardpoint is ours. Hardpoint contested. Hostiles have captured the hardpoint.
okay, 6 and 8. Okay.
Okay, so this is where we were last time, which is the triple loop in relationship to the Diamond Sutra. So in each case, there's a problem with the epistemological resources. So what do we think we know? So the first loop is to suspend the inefficiency of what we think we know. So what we count as knowledge cannot get the job done. So what's happening with the Diamond Sutra case is Subhuti, but also the others, being fixated on the Bodhisattva vehicle, because that's what Subhuti wants to learn how to follow from the Buddha. So the Buddha wants him to shift about how we think about the role of the Bodhisattva. So the common sense understanding of the Bodhisattva is being deconstructed. So very often the Bodhisattva is discussed as a savior. And in fact, that is not the case. There is no one who does the saving. There's no one to be saved. And there is no act of salvation. So that's the first part that needs to be suspended. So once Subhuti understands that he is looking in the wrong direction, he is redirected. So what he thinks he knows is insufficient. It's not enough. He needs more. So there are upayic doctrines, that is skillful means, that have been discussed by the Buddha. And we saw that in the Lotus Sutra, the 3 vehicles. But you have to shift about how you talk about Buddhist practice. And the main formula that is used in the Diamond Sutra is quite unique. X is not X and therefore is called X. A bodhisattva is not a bodhisattva and therefore is called a bodhisattva. So X can be any Buddhist concept. The Dharma is not Dharma and therefore is called Dharma. So that is the cognitive dissonance that is being provoked, so that we stop and think about what Buddhist philosophy actually is trying to communicate. But more importantly, the Buddha is trying to evaluate whether or not Subhuti, despite all of his wisdom, has the wisdom gone beyond. And can he get on that path to the wisdom gone beyond? And that requires emptiness, not just the concept of emptiness, but the practice of emptiness. So the final loop is letting go of the inadequacy of what you think you know, the epistemological resources. So there is an option. The option is the Buddha vehicle. That's also what is discussed in the Lotus Sutra. And so you have to reject what are called in the Diamond Sutra thought coverings. So these are constructs, perceptions, the lakshana that we've talked about, the ways in which the mind has constructed a map of reality. So let go of the map and take the journey. So that requires that we change how we live. And specifically, what we need to do is to remain non-abiding and unsupported. So that goes all the way back to the second section of the Diamond Sutra, as we'll see. Any questions about this process? If you're confused, that's a good sign. Cognitive dissonance is required in the Diamond Sutra. This is definitely the most challenging philosophical discussion that we've had this semester. When students in philosophy ask me where they should start their reading of Buddhism, and I always recommend primary sources, if they do have a background in philosophy, I always recommend the Diamond Sutra because it has very deep meaning, philosophically speaking. So any questions? I know this is puzzling stuff, and it is to Subhuti as well. So there's that cognitive dissonance, this mental distress or discomfort. In the case of Subhuti, he has this idea that he wants to follow the Bodhisattva path, and now he's being redirected to the Buddha path by the Buddha. So this leads him to re-examine what he thought he knew about Buddhist practice. He can't rely on his machine thinking, what he has stored up in his memory, what he's been programmed to believe. He has to be responsive. He has to respond to the environment that is being provided by the Buddha. So strangely enough, there's a connection here with cat videos. So science confirms what we already knew in our hearts. Videos of cats unrolling and then re-rolling toilet paper are good for your brain health. Anything that makes us laugh is good for our brains. So the laughter is the connection here. Cognitive dissonance is very much a part of humor. So you're confronted with what you think is one kind of idea, and then the joke shifts you to a different idea. So I was trying to think of a good joke, but there's the old Buddhist one. The Buddhist goes into the restaurant and orders a pizza, and when he's asked what kind of pizza he wants, he says, "Make me one with everything." Don't hear any laughing. So there's two ways that you can interpret "make me one with everything." Is he talking about the pizza, or is he talking about Buddhist practice? So where, again, does this fit in with cognitive dissonance? Well, it has to do with your brain activity. So as it says here, they did a study. So they measured the brain activity in participants watching a laughter-inducing 20-minute video. And I should point out there's two different kinds of laughter. There's the laughter of the left brain, which is a calculated kind of laughter. It's a social response laughter, particularly, for example, when your boss tells a joke, which is pretty stupid, but you laugh anyway. So you're not really finding it amusing. And then there's the right brain kind of laughter, and that's the one that is unleashed by cat videos, among other things. So the optimal laughter for the brain, 30 to 40 hertz frequency, matches brainwave frequencies seen in people who have a true state of meditation. So meditation does to your brain what laughter, in a more superficial sense, does to your brain. What is important here is that it allows you to redirect. So it's part of that suspending what you thought you knew, redirect in a completely different direction. So from Bodhisattva to Buddha, and then let go. And as they explain, this allows the subjective feeling states of being able to think more clearly and have more integrative thoughts. So you're letting go of what you thought you knew and letting in a response to what's actually in front of you. And that's also what the Buddha is trying to do for Subhuti. So this is of great value to individuals who need or want to revisit, reorganize, and rearrange various aspects of lives or experiences. And that's exactly what Subhuti is doing. He's rethinking, rearranging what he thought he knew about Buddhist practice. And result, to make you feel more whole or more focused. Any questions about that? So there's something going on in the brain here. So there's that formula. I'm gonna kind of pass over this. Talk about emptiness. There's some quotes here. So the ability to see things normally is no small thing. To be really normal is unusual. Why is that? Because we're so conditioned, programmed like that computer. So in that normality begins to bubble up inspiration. So can Subhuti become normal again? So the summary, part 1, part 2. In the first part, we're going to take a look at now the programming of focused learning directed at the Bodhisattva path is exposed by the Buddha indirectly. Task-driven attention focused on getting an algorithm, a step-by-step process from the Buddha has to be suspended. So that caters to the machine mind. The view of mere followers are excellent sheep who still depend on the Buddha as an authority figure. So that's what Subhuti is at the beginning. He is one of the excellent sheep. He's a great follower, but the Buddha doesn't want followers. So the Buddha can't just say that. He gradually has to provide the environment that will bring about the shift in Subhuti's mind, the shift towards diffuse learning. This is stimulus-driven, responding again to that environment, interacting with the Buddha. So first, Subhuti asks questions, and then he begins to answer questions. So he suspends his very narrow view of Dharma as a task that is to be achieved, redirects to the Buddha path, and then lets go of all views that he held before. So he is arriving at the view of no view. Now, if he hasn't arrived at it yet, by the time we get to the end of the Diamond Sutra, he is at least aware that there is such a thing. So the catalyst is the cognitive dissonance or cognitive disfluency. So it's difficult, it's challenging, it's frustrating, but that's what allows him to move forward. Any question about that? So it's really the shift that we're interested in. And on the other side of the shift is the wisdom gone beyond. Okay, so let's move to the actual text. So as we said, there are 32 sections in the Diamond Sutra. We're going to take them in little chunks, the first 5. Number 1 is a day in the life of the Buddha. It's just a description of the setting. It seems to be separate from the rest of the discussion about wisdom gone beyond. But actually, this is the teaching of the Diamond Sutra. It's what we call teaching by ostensive definition. Instead of using words or language, you point to what you're trying to indicate. So what does it look like to be awakened? That's what we're shown in section 1. From the outside, it's very normal. But as we saw in the previous quote, to be normal is extraordinary because most of us are acting in relationship to a diluted view of reality, and therefore we are acting in an abnormal manner. Part 2 brings out the question from Subhuti himself. How does one function as a bodhisattva? Where does one stand or abide? How does one control or master the mind? That's what he wants to know. So give me the instructions, Buddha. The Buddha then turns the attention to what actually is a bodhisattva. The general definition is someone who is able to liberate all beings, who leads others to awakening. And yet, if you look at it in terms of the philosophical consistency of Buddhism, there is no such thing as liberation. There's no one to be liberated, and there is no liberator. And all of that goes back to the deconstruction of me, or the sense of identity. If there is no me, single separate identity, then there is no person needing to be saved, and there is no separate being who will be their savior. And if there is no saving done, then there really is nothing that the bodhisattva is achieving as a task. But our task-driven minds think of it in that way. The next topic is merit or generosity, which is considered to be a standard activity of a bodhisattva. But again, there's a redefinition or a deconstruction of the common sense meaning of merit. So there's nothing that you're actually accruing here. Non-reliance on objects, sense status, or signs, appearances. And so the most productive practice is like the emptiness of space. There's no there. No limits, but also no obstacles or constructs, no signs or signposts. And then he moved to the definition, again, common definition of a Buddha, which involves what they call the 32 signs or characteristics. The physical appearance of a Buddha. This was something that was incorporated into the sculpture of Buddhas. That also is a misunderstanding. So how do you identify a Buddha? Well, not by physical traits. So it's not in one is or is not a Buddha, but both a Buddha and not a Buddha, appearance and reality. So the setting is Jeddah Grove. This was a donation to the Buddha from one of his wealthy devotees. So that he's in his home state of Kosala. He spent about half of his teaching career there, 25 of the 45 years that he taught after his awakening. We're told that there's over 1,000 monks. The Sanskrit version mentions Bodhisattva Mahasattvas. So this indicates that this is an early sutra. Seems to be a very homegrown kind of audience, so you don't get supernatural beings or Garudas or heavenly musicians, as we saw in the Lotus Sutra. So it's very different. It's just exactly the kind of audience that might have shown up to listen to the Buddha. So that gives some credence to the theory that the translator Redpine has, that this might actually be a transcript of an interaction that the Buddha had with one of his disciples. And so we get this detailed description of the Buddha's activity in the first section. He dresses himself, he collects alms, that is food, from the neighborhood. He eats that food. He arranges his bowl and robe, which are two of the few things that a monastic would actually own. Washes his feet, a couple additional details in the Sanskrit version. And then he settles himself down to receive questions from the audience. So he literally is making a home for himself. Wherever he is his home. So this is the actual text. We could also see it as the teaching of no teaching. So that's something that's going to be talked about in Chan Buddhism that we're going to start talking about next week. Since there are limitations to language itself in terms of communicating the message of the Buddha, there is this other form of teaching which does not resemble teaching in the usual sense. You can teach, as in this case, by ostensive definition. The question that is being posed by Subhuti is actually answered before he asks the question. The answer is right here in section 1. So I often tell students, if you understand section 1, we can stop here. We don't have to go any further because it's all here. Anybody ready to stop? Not yet. Okay. So we have to unpeel the layers. So like all the other sutras and suttas, it starts with the voice of Ananda, thus have I heard, tells us where the Buddha is. Now it's referring to the Buddha as the Lord, but this doesn't mean the Lord on high, the Lord God. It just means somebody in a position of authority. So we have to disconnect it from the religious connotations that we would have in, let's say, an English setting. But even in England, they talk about the Lord of the manor, the Lord of the castle. So it's more in that sense. So there he is in Jeta Grove, in the garden, with this gathering of monks, and again, the bodhisattvas. So early in the morning, he dressed, put on his cloak, took his bowl, entered the great city to collect alms. So they didn't grow their own food in order to be fed so they could survive. They took donations. And the way of taking the donation, sometimes it's unfortunately called begging for food, but in fact, there was a ritual to it that you would just show up at somebody's door and stand there and wait and see if they would give you some food. And usually the food would be leftovers. So it's in the morning, maybe leftovers from the meal the night before. So when he had eaten, returned from his round, he put away his bowl and his cloak, washed his feet, sat down on the seat arranged for him, crossed his legs, hold his body upright, and mindfully fixing his attention in front of him. So I've put that in green because this is perhaps the one indicator that he's different than the other monks. So if we were there outside the grove looking in, we could see over 1,000 of the monks there, and this one guy sitting in the middle, and he dresses exactly like all the others. They're all have shaved heads. And if we're not clued in to his identity, we just think he is another one of the monks. But what does set him apart is his mind, that he is mindfully fixing his attention in front of him. So he is open, receptive to whatever questions are going to come. He is in a stimulus-driven mode. He's not there to accomplish a certain task. As I said, he doesn't show up and read a lecture or have a set topic that he wants to present. He responds to what the audience needs. So the monks approach, they salute his feet with their heads. This is just what they did in ancient India. 3 times they walk around him to the right, and then they sit down next to him. So that's all part of the ritual. But that's it. They want to know, using the voice of Subhuti, how do you practice Buddhism? And he's showing them right there. This is what the practice of Buddhism looks like. But what's happening in his mind, that cognitive shift that he has already realized through his awakening, that's what they haven't gotten yet. Any questions here?
I got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the mindful fixing his attention in front of him. So is he like going in a state of no mind where he's just kind of being in that moment and is receptive to, like you said, not just the questions, but to everything, if you will. So he's showing them by virtue?
Yes, so he is, cognitively, his mind is at a elevated state. What makes the big difference, as we've seen, is the lack of the ego. So as long as the ego is there, it's always drawing us back down to a very narrow focus. So what's in it for me? What do I want to accomplish? But he doesn't have any of those agendas. He's just existing and responsive to his environment. So he's not zoning out. He's completely there. Sometimes they use the phrase being here now. Other questions? In some English translations, they actually leave out section 1 because they don't even realize how important it is. So what has this to do with the wisdom that has gone beyond? As I said, the question that's going to be posed in section 2 is already answered in section 1, and the underlying message is that of non-dualism. So these are 3 different translators commenting on the facts that this is the way things are. So Redpine says, the remaining 31 chapters of the sutra attempt to explain what happens in the first. In other words, what's unique about the mind of an awakened being like Buddha. Master Xing Yun says, it is essential that one understand the unity of the ordinary and the ultimate, the commonplace and the transcendental, samsara and nirvana, if one wants to understand the Diamond Sutra. Like a great artist, the Buddha not only says what he means, he also shows us what he means, shows us by the way he purports himself. Ultimate wisdom and ordinary reality are inextricably intertwined. So you don't have to go to another place. There is no other shore of nirvana. It's right here now. The only thing that changes is your mind, your cognitive functioning. Another master says the ordinary consciousness of daily life is no different from that of all Buddhas. So you have exactly the same cognitive capacity as a Buddha. But the problem is you haven't mobilized it yet. And that's what is the challenge for our friend Subhuti. He hasn't quite understood that yet. So here we come with the question. So very often in the sutras, there's one, usually a disciple, who is the questioner and engages one-on-one with the Buddha on behalf of the entire audience. So it's not just his question, but he's doing it on behalf of others. And the green part, I added that on. Flawed question, how can pigs fly? He's already assuming that pigs can fly, he just wants to know how to do it. But in fact, there's a defect in his question, although the Buddha doesn't say that. It's not a part of his teaching style. So Subhuti, venerable, so he's been with the Buddha for a long time. You saw that depiction of him. He's an old man by then. Comes into the assembly, sits down, which signals that he's going to engage with the Buddha. Rises from his seat, put his upper robe over one shoulder, places his right knee on the ground, bent forth his folded hands, and then asks. So again, this is the ritual practice that they engaged in. It is wonderful, it is exceedingly wonderful, O well gone Tathagata, how much the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, have been helped with the greatest help by the Tathagata, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one. So he's paying tribute to the assistance that the Buddha has offered them. It is wonderful how much the Bodhisattvas, the great beings, have been favored with the highest favor by the Tathagata. How then should a son or daughter of good family who have set out in the Bodhisattva vehicle stand, how progress, how control their thoughts? Now, I think it's significant that he's speaking on behalf of both men and women. So the son and daughter of a good family, that just indicates someone who comes from, let's say, a good Buddhist family, a family that is committed to the Dharma. So this is a procedural question. So you're the Bodhisattva, you're the awakened one. We want to know how to do it. And then very specifically, how to stand, how to progress, how to control their thoughts. And this is where his error slips in. There is no place to stand. There is no progress in the sense that you attain something. And it's not really about controlling thought. But that's not the immediate response. So when Buddha hears this, he actually seems enthusiastic. Well said. So it is, Subhuti, so it is as you say. The Tathagata has helped the bodhisattvas, the great beings with the greatest help, has favored them with the highest favor. Here's a big clue, therefore, listen well and attentively. So I think he's signaling, yes, this is how you have come to understand what is required to follow the bodhisattva path. But he's actually going to reveal much more. Not that he couldn't reveal it earlier, but the audience wasn't ready. So I will teach you how those who have set out in the bodhisattva vehicle should stand, how progress, how control their thoughts. So Subhuti himself, as the questioner, has a interesting backstory. He's considered an expert in meditation that focuses on friendliness. So this is discussed in the Anguttara Nikaya. He is said to be devoid of inner and outer conflict. So he has come to, let's say, a level of equanimity. He's known for teaching perfect wisdom, prajnaparamita, and emptiness. So those were his special topics. So he seems to be an expert on the main topic of the sutra, which is emptiness. Excuse me. So he advocates some popular early form of meditation in Mahayana, which focuses on the Buddhist qualities. So that comes up in the discussion. They're going to talk about the 32 marks of a Buddha. Now his name means born of emptiness. Subhuti, born of emptiness. And the backstory there is that there was a disappearance of treasures from the storehouse of his wealthy family on the day he was born. So their treasure disappeared. 7 days later, it came back. So this has been interpreted as the emptying of emptiness. So he is born into emptiness. So by the time he arrives at the period of the Diamond Sutra, he is advanced in age, as we saw in his depiction, and that's also associated with wisdom. But of course, we know that the next stage is wisdom gone beyond. So that would be the compassion born from the realization of emptiness or shunyata. So he has a very special role to play here in taking it to the next level, let's say. Not just the teaching of emptiness, but the living of emptiness, because that's what the Buddha has demonstrated in section 1. That's how you live emptiness. After you've shifted your mind from the task-driven to the stimulus-driven. Any questions here? So these are a couple of different ways that the question of Subhuti has been translated. When good men and good women commit themselves to highest complete enlightenment, that would be Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, on what should they base themselves and should they subdue their minds? What should they rely on? What should they do to master their thinking? And if a noble son or daughter should set forth on the bodhisattva path, how should they stand? How should they walk? How should they control their thoughts? So the underlying parts show the similarity here, and that's where the error is. What do you base yourself on? What do you rely on? Where do you take your stand? In fact, there is nothing to base yourself on. You don't need any external help. You don't need any authority. You don't want to rely on anything or have a position where you take that stand and therefore are no longer dynamic. You might note that at the end of the Heart Sutra, it talks about the bodhisattva who leans on nothing but prajnaparamita. So it's your practice of prajnaparamita. That's the only thing you can depend on. And if you depend on something else, then you're not actually going to have the realization. That's what's holding you back, because you're already assuming there is something there that you need to rely on or base yourself on or stand on. And that's going to come up later in the discussion. But Subhuti's not ready to hear that yet. So he seems to be asking for a step-by-step process, what we could call an algorithm of how to abide. Abide could also be translated as progress and control thoughts in order to accomplish the task of supreme enlightenment. But enlightenment is not a task. As long as you're in the task-driven mode, you're not going to realize enlightenment. So the people in the audience, future leaders of Buddhism, the Buddha has a special interest in promoting their progress. But it's not progress the way that they conceive of it. It's cognitive progress, that shift in their mindset. So if he can help one bodhisattva, he'll actually be helping myriads of bodhisattvas. So it's not just Subhuti's problem. So I found this article, which I thought was quite relevant here, because it helps us to understand why the Buddha doesn't, at the very beginning, question the question. The Buddha responds to the question in a very positive way, not a critical way. And in a sense, it's like an adult trying to take a question from a child, because they're at a more naive level of experience. So these are the tips that they give. When you get a tough question, listen for what the child is really asking. So don't rush to answer. And that's exactly what the Buddha does. So why is Subhuti asking about the bodhisattva path? How does that reveal his misunderstanding of what it means to be a bodhisattva and his lack of focus on becoming a Buddha? Same problem we saw in the Lotus Sutra. Second, give them facts, but at a pace they can manage. And again, that's what the Buddha does. He doesn't give him a lecture, but he guides him to his own understanding of what was wrong with his question. Say something positive, like, that's a great question, let's find out more together. Well, that seems to be what the Buddha is intending when he says, well said. You know, that's great. Reassure them they are safe and loved. In other words, don't be negative and critical. Don't be afraid to share your emotions. In this case, we'd be talking about the highest level of emotions, the uplifting emotions, like compassion, joy, equanimity. So Buddha's response is gradually revealed through other sections. So we're just at section 2, but in section 9 and then 10 and 14, this is where we get the actual clues to what's wrong with the question. So in section 9, Buddha says, Subhuti, this son of good family, who is the foremost of those who dwell in peace, does not dwell anywhere. That is why he is called a dweller in peace. So he's referring to Subhuti himself. You don't dwell or fixate on any particular place. So there's nowhere to stand. There's no place to abide. So that's what he was looking for. Tell me where I should stand. But he's trying to get him to understand there is no place. The next section 10, Buddha says, Subhuti, the bodhisattva, the great being, should produce an unsupported thought. So he's looking for a support. And the Buddha says, well, that's actually the opposite of what you should be doing. Your thoughts shouldn't be supported by anything. A thought which is nowhere supported. A thought unsupported by sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touchables, or mind objects. mind objects would be those thought coverings. It should be a spontaneous response to reality, not an internal mentation. Going even further in section 14, he says, Subhuti, the Bodhi being, the great being, after he has got rid of all perceptions, that would be the lakshana we've talked about, conceptions could also be included there, should raise his thought to the utmost right and perfect enlightenment. Because that's what Subhuti asks about this notion of anuttara samyak sambodhi. He should produce a thought which is unsupported by form, sounds, smells, tastes, touchables, or mind objects, unsupported by dharma, by the teaching, unsupported by no dharma, unsupported by anything. And here is the ultimate statement that he wants to communicate. All supports actually have no support. So everything we think that we can depend on, that will support us, is part of our deluded view of reality. That includes thinking of the Buddha as a support. Because this is something that has to be the shift in your own mind. There's nothing out there that's going to make it happen. So everybody get a sense of what the message is there, given in little bits and not immediately.
It seems like to me that that the Buddha just keeps on coming back to the same lesson, that original, like before the five skandhas, before we start having that consciousness, is living in that, being in that moment. And so when he says no sights, sounds, tastes, or touchables, it's like a non-attachment to everything that we've experienced in this physical world. And being there in the moment, you get like these higher revelations of understanding.
Yes, so it's easy to repeat what the Buddha has said, but does Subhuti really understand that? So I'm sure he's heard something very similar from the Buddha before, but he hasn't really lived the fact that all supports have actually no support.
And we can tell that by his question.
As we get through the second part of the sutra, you begin to see this change in Subhuti in terms of how he responds and what kind of questions he asks. So this is one of the most difficult things for people who teach for a living. You're saying things, the students are repeating back what you said, and it sounds great, but do you really know whether they know? Do they really know that they know? Because sometimes people think they know, like Subhuti, they're really close, but they just haven't walked through that door yet. And you can't walk through for them, you can't pull them through. You need to provide that environment where the shift can take place. And that's what he's doing. He's kind of the last final exam for Subhuti. You've got all the right words and the right concepts, but are you really able to live them? That's the challenge here. That's what makes it so cognitive. It's all about what's going on in his mind. So the problem of standing on, abiding in mental constructs. So true perception, that is indeed no perception. So what we perceive is based on a deluded sense of reality. So the Buddhas, the Lords, have left all perceptions or conceptions behind. So this is all from section 14. So that especially includes the four concepts of self-identity, which is brought up several times in the sutra. The perception of our single separate identity, such as an Atman. It's divided into four different expressions: the notion of an I, a human being, a living being, a soul. 15, the Bodhisattva got rid of all perceptions, which produces an unsupported thought, which is not stuck or fixated. So all supports have no support. Those all beings of whom the Tathagata has spoken are indeed no beings. Seen Subhuti by the Tathagata with his non-discriminating Buddha mind, something that is unthinkable and incomparable is this discourse on Dharma. So as soon as we try to think it, turn it into internal mentation, we've already lost the lived aspect. 16, the Tathagata has taught this discourse on Dharma as unthinkable. So just an unthinkable karma results should be expected from it. 17, he who is set out on the Bodhisattva vehicle, he is not one of the Dharmas. So remember, the Dharmas are just these experiences that we have constructed so that we can make sense of them. So a bodhisattva is just not another thing. What makes a bodhisattva is how they live. So there's not any dharma by which the Tathagata, when he was with the Tathagata Dipankara, has fully known the utmost right and perfect enlightenment. So even the Dharma as teaching, that can become another mental construct. So this is where they start talking about the Bodhisattva vehicle, because that's what Subhuti asks about. So liberation both is and is not possible. So it goes back to the issue of the anatma, the non-atma. So Subhuti, someone who is set out in the vehicle of a bodhisattva, should produce a thought in this manner. As many beings as there are in the universe of beings, comprehended under the term beings. And in ancient India, they saw them in either born from an egg or a womb or from moisture or miraculously. So that's their biological science at the time. With or without form, with perception, without perception, with neither perception nor non-perception, as far as any conceivable form of being is conceived. So the audience for a bodhisattva are all beings, because this is the wisdom embracing all species. If you think of yourself as a bodhisattva in that sense, then those are the beings that you are responsible for. All these I must lead to nirvana, into that realm of nirvana which leaves nothing behind. Sounds like common sense Buddhism. And here's where the twist comes in. This is the shift. And yet, although innumerable beings have thus been led to nirvana, no being at all has been led to nirvana. So everybody knows that the job of a bodhisattva is to bring others into awakening, lead them to nirvana. But what he's actually pointing out is the philosophical inconsistency of that doctrine. If in a bodhisattva the notion of a being should take place, he could not be called a bodhi being. So if the bodhisattva sees him or herself as a being who is going to save other beings, then that is not a bodhisattva. That is not a wisdom being, because there are no single separate beings. One being cannot engage other beings as a self versus other. So he is not to be called a bodhi being, a wisdom being, in whom the notion of a self, of a persona should take place, or the notion of a living soul or a person. So I provided the Chinese text here. So these are slightly different ways of self-identification. You can identify yourself versus the other, yourself as a human being versus non-human beings, as organic versus non-organic, and living versus non-living, or having specifically some kind of personhood. So no matter how you identify that self, if you think it's separate from the other, being that you're intending to save, then you don't really know what a bodhisattva is. So this ever-expanding sense of identity to distinguish self from what is not self, that's the primal delusion. So we're going to skip there. And continuing with the common sense misunderstanding or perception of a bodhisattva is the idea of merit. Now, the issue of merit comes up many times in this sutra, but many also other Mahayana sutras. And apparently it was a big issue among Buddhist practitioners because it makes Buddhism transactional. What does it mean to be transactional?
You give something in order to get something.
That's right. That's right. So that actually ties in with the whole problem of the self. If you do nice things for people or beings because you expect to get paid back in the sense of some kind of spiritual merit, I like to think of it as your spiritual bank account, then you don't really understand merit. If you are expecting a payback, it's not a gift, it's a transaction. So a bodhisattva who gives a gift should not be supported by a thing, nor should he be supported anywhere. You're not doing it for a particular purpose or for a particular end. When he gives gifts, he should not be supported by sight objects, sounds, smells, taste, touchables, or mind objects. The bodhisattva, the great being, should give gifts in a way that he is not supported by the notion of a sign. You don't want to signify anything by the gift. You don't want to make it a marker. Oh, look at this very generous person. You're not giving the gift, let's say, because it's going to give you a tax write-off. If that's how you give away your donations, they're not really gifts. They're transactions. And why is this? The heap of merit of that Bodhi being who unsupported gives it a gift is not easy to measure. So real merit is not a payback, but it's just living your life as a generous being. And then he tries to get him to imagine how immense that merit is, the merit that is not seeking merit in this transactional sense. Is it easy to measure the extent of space in the south, west, or north, downwards, upwards, or intermediate directions, in all the 10 directions? So Buddha says no. Even so, the heap of merit of that Bodhi being who unsupported gives the gift is not easy to measure. That is why, Subhuti, those who have set forth in the Bodhisattva vehicle should give gifts without being supported by the notion of a sign. You're not doing it to get recognition. You're not doing it to build up that spiritual bank account. But I think you can understand why some practitioners who even thought of themselves as very good Buddhists did that. They want to get something when they give something. But if that's how you're thinking, you're still stuck on that deluded sense of self. Who is it that's getting the merit? Who does the merit belong to? So this notion of being unsupported, so non-reliance, non-dependence, not standing on anything, not fixated, not resting or leaning on anything, not settled or entrenched, has to be that constant flow. This desire for a sense of security, no clinging to expectations, no blind faith. And that's why later in Chan, we have this seemingly strange statement: if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Because if you meet the Buddha on the road, there's a danger that you're going to become fixated on the Buddha and ask the Buddha all kinds of silly questions like, where shall I stand on the Bodhisattva vehicle? We're going to be talking about the source of this quote in the next couple weeks. So we assume we need support when in fact we don't. As long as we keep the training wheels on our bicycle, it's not going to be a bicycle. So this goes against the essential quality of self-reliance. So Subhuti has the wisdom of shunyata, but he hasn't made the transition to compassion. So the wisdom is what you know, compassion, based on shunyata, is how you live. Intellectual expertise has to evolve into practice. Talking the talk, which he can do very well, has to evolve into walking the walk. And the verbal message that he is relying on, that's why he wants to get this algorithm from the Buddha. The text is just the messenger. It's not the message. So the verbal message is not the real message of the Buddha. It's just the finger pointing at the moon. So now, somewhat abruptly, the topic switches from bodhisattvas to Buddhas, because that's really where the Buddha wants Subhuti to focus his attention. So what do you think, Subhuti? Can the Tathagata be seen by the possession of his 32 marks? So there's lakshana, how we perceive something. Now, this is very interesting because Subhuti is beginning to realize that the Buddha is looking for a deeper understanding of the Dharma. Subhuti says no. So just focusing on the perception, what you think you see, that doesn't reveal the underlying reality of a Tathagata or a Buddha. That's who is being referred to, somebody who's enlightened. So he says, no, indeed, and why? What has been taught by the Tathagata as the possession of marks, that is truly a no possession of no marks. And Buddha says, wherever there is possession of marks, there is fraud. Wherever there is no possession of no marks, there is no fraud. Hence, the Tathagata is to be seen from no marks as marks. So if you're looking for certain qualities, physical qualities, and there are 32 that are marked, long hanging earlobes was one of them. That unusual kind of hair that you see on Buddha statues. So that list from the surface might seem to qualify someone as a Buddha, but your physical appearance is not what makes you a Buddha. Today we've got excellent plastic surgeons, and they could probably take that list of 32 marks and turn anyone into something that looks like that. But that wouldn't make you a Buddha, would it? What makes you a Buddha is seen from no marks as marks. Don't depend on the superficial appearance, because the only thing that really matters that makes a Buddha is what's happening in the mind. So not physical marks or signs or mere appearance, these illusions. Marks manifest merit. No marks equal no merit. So merit, you're again looking for something, some kind of signal, some kind of indicator. That means you're depending on something. So when the illusory nature of form is perceived, the Tathagata is recognized. So the true body is what they call the Dharmakaya. Kaya means body. The Dharmakaya is not a body in a physical sense at all. Dharma here is the message of the Buddha. The message has no form. It's not physical. There's also what they call the physical body of the Buddha, the Nirmanakaya. So that would be the physical body of the historical Buddha. And something called the spirit body or the enjoyment body, Sambhogakaya. But the one that is crucial is the formless message. It's not a body at all. It's nothing that has a superficial appearance. So Master Shingen says, this section explains how to approach enlightenment. The bodily attributes of the Tathagata make up the body that comes with enlightenment. Again, it's not a physical body. You might think of it more as that cognitive shift. To recognize this Dharma body is to realize enlightenment. But to think that its nature is real is to miss the mark. Thus, he points to the Dharma body to explain the emptiness of enlightenment. You're emptying out everything you want to depend on or stand on or abide in. So thusness means the complete nowness and thisness of here and now. It is awareness without filters. That's what the Buddha was demonstrating in section 1. Without distance, without mediating concepts. So who perceives that all characteristics are in fact no characteristics perceives the Tathagata. So X is not X and therefore has been called X. So the characteristics that are assumed to indicate a Buddha are not characteristics that indicate a Buddha. That's why we call them characteristics of a Buddha. So the crucial part here is the calling. We put them into a linguistic format, a label. So the appearance of no appearance. There is no thing for the 32 marks to attach to. At one point, that could be a form of upaya to help people try to understand a Buddha, because each of those 32 marks is symbolic. But then they took the symbolism too seriously. At the time of the Buddha himself, there were no statues of the Buddha. There were no representations of his physical form. That only comes later as a teaching tool, I guess we could call it. So 6, Subhuti asks about faith, abandon teachings as perceptions. That's what he's told. 7, Buddha asks about the Tathagata's accomplishments, which are said to be indescribable. Notice how we're getting, Subhuti originally asks the question and now Buddha's asking questions in return. Buddha asks about merit. And the conclusion is that the message is more important than materialism. So it's not the things that you give that give you merit. It's giving the message, particularly the message of the Diamond Sutra, that is meritus, a true gift. 9, Buddha asks about stages of attainment for would-be arhats. And here Subhuti realizes that there is no such thing as attainment. Saw the same thing in the Heart Sutra. Buddha asks about the Tathagata's attainment. Again, there is no attainment. It's a realization, not an attaining. It's not a thing that you're getting. 11, Buddha asks about merit associated with the sutra. And again, the message of the sutra is more valuable than any physical thing that you could give. 12, Buddha talks about the sacredness of location. So this is where they talk about Buddha lands and pure lands. Any place where the message is heard clearly is a pure land. So there's no location, physical location for these so-called pure lands. So I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little. So what's important here is the bodhisattvas who would be around at the time when the Buddha is no longer alive, they don't really need the Buddha. They are bodhisattvas who are capable of depending on only themselves based on the problem of perception, lakshanas, deluded awareness. What they have that makes them different, what shift has taken place in their mind is first, there is no perception of a self. There is no perception of a being, no perception of a soul, no perception of a person. So those different forms of deluded identity have been obliterated in these bodhisattvas. They don't have a perception of a dharma, that is the teaching as a settled construct. They have no perception of a no dharma. So they're not going to engage in dharma. Well, if it's not dharma, then it must be no dharma. Well, that's dualism. There's no perception at all and no non-perception. So the whole notion of perception as diluted awareness is let go of. So if these bodhisattvas should have a perception of either a dharma or no dharma, they would thereby seize on a self, a being, a soul, or a person. Because a bodhisattva should not seize on either a dharma or a no dharma. You don't need something to stand on. Therefore, this saying has been taught by the Tathagata with a hidden meaning. Those who know the discourse on dharma are like unto a raft, should forsake dharmas, still more so no dharmas. So this raft is the image that we talked about even back in Buddhism as Theravada, where there's samsara on one shore, nirvana on the other. You jump on the raft, which is the dharma, the teaching, and it takes you to the other side. So you use the dharma teaching as a means to the end, but then you let that dharma, that raft go. But you also don't get stuck on no dharmas. It's not an either or. So not being attached to any mental law or concept or formula. That is what the mind of the bodhisattva is like. So you're not looking for any algorithm, which is, as we said, pretty much what Subhuti was asking for in the beginning. Seven, the teaching of no teaching, no reliance on language. Subhuti is discussing this with the Buddha. And the Buddha asks, what do you think? Is there any dharma which the Tathagata has fully known as the utmost right and perfect enlightenment? Or is there any dharma which the Tathagata has demonstrated? So again, Subhuti is beginning to understand the underlying meaning here. This dharma which the Tathagata has fully known or demonstrated cannot be grasped, cannot be talked about. It is neither a dharma nor no dharma. So there's something that cannot be put into words, that cannot be fully discussed. So he's got that concept, but does he have the ability to live that? So what Subhuti has been looking for, this algorithm that explains the bodhisattva path, cannot be found. It cannot be grasped, it cannot be talked about. It is neither a dharma nor a no dharma. It's more about merit here. I want to actually move along so we can get to section 12, get some Buddha Sutra stuff there. So this is the notion that there is not a particular spot that is a holy spot. That spot of earth where one has taken from this discourse on Dharma but one stanza of 4 lines, taught or illuminated it. That spot on earth will be a veritable shrine for the whole world. So you don't need to build edifices. All you need is the meaning of the words of the Buddha. We can't even call it a text because at this point there is no text. It's a discourse. So what then should we say of those who will bear in mind this discourse on Dharma in its entirety, who will recite, study, and illuminate it in full detail for others? So not just repeat the words, but dig deeper and get the underlying meaning. So just give you a sense of the next piece coming up. This is part 2, which starts with section 13. So there has been progress on the part of Subhuti in terms of understanding that he really did not understand Buddhism. And so he's beginning to respond to the questions of the Buddha in a way that shows that there really is no way for the language itself to encapsulate the message. And in 13, Subhuti asks, and this is a rather unusual question in the Buddhist literature, he says, what then is this discourse on Dharma, and how should I bear it in mind? So what do you call this discussion we're having? And Buddha says, this discourse on Dharma is called wisdom which has gone beyond. So Prajnaparamita. And as such should you bear it in mind. And why? Just that which the Tathagata has taught as the wisdom which has gone beyond, just that he has taught as not gone beyond. Therefore is it called wisdom which has gone beyond. What do you think, Subhuti? Is there any Dharma which the Tathagata has taught? And Subhuti says, no, there is not. So the Dharma as the message cannot be taught using words. So even when we talk about it as wisdom gone beyond, we have to realize that that's just a label that we're using for a convenience. So wisdom gone beyond means it has gone beyond even language itself. And this is where we get this important break in 14, Subhuti's tears. In Chan, we talk about the crack in the rice paper. It's somebody who has had an insight, a breakthrough, but it's a minor breakthrough, so it's just a crack in the rice paper. When the whole rice paper is blown away, that's awakening. But he's seeing something he hadn't seen before. So after this discussion, Subhuti is moved to tears. Something has begun to shift deeply in his cognition. Having wiped away his tears, he spoke, "It is wonderful, it is exceedingly wonderful, how well the Tathagata has taught this discourse on Dharma. Through it, cognition has been produced in me. Not have I ever before heard such a discourse. Most wonderfully blessed will be those who, when this sutra is being taught, will produce a true perception. That which is true perception, that is indeed no perception. To truly perceive is to not turn your experience into a single separate perception or conception or construct." Now the wording here is quite interesting. So how does he express his breakthrough? Different translators put it different ways. Kanza says the impact of Dharma moved Venerable Subhuti to tears. Red Pine says by the force of this Dharma, Subhuti was moved to tears. Another pair of translators say an interior realization of its meaning, deep understanding of the meaning, comprehending its deep meaning, or penetrated deeply into its significance. This is what has created the tears. That deep dive into the meaning the Buddha is trying to convey. The meaning that is necessarily not limited to language itself. So this is the support of no support. Prajnaparamita is the support of no support that he was asking for. Because you can't lean on Prajnaparamita. Prajnaparamita is the cognitive shift itself, going from the task-driven to the stimulus-driven. But that's not the end of the sutra. So we're going to need a little bit more time next week to kind of wrap up the Diamond Sutra, and then we'll be moving on to the Zen text. So any questions at this point?
Do we have an essay this week?
Yes, I've got it in a raw form and I'll send it out within the next hour.
Okay.
Got it right here.
I also have, I also had trouble finding the commentary 7. I just went through the October 6th and 8th and opened everything up and I couldn't find the 7 either.
Oh, okay, I'll check that out. Yeah, so I'll send that to everybody directly, and if it's not on Canvas, I'll make sure it's there.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Anybody have any
No.
remaining questions?
Well, I kind of do. I don't know
Mhm.
how to phrase it best. Are you familiar with the notion of spontaneous awakening that some people report?
Yes, the Sudden Awakening School in John that we're going to be looking at. Mhm.
So, I mean, spontaneous awakening is not something that can be taught. It just happens to people. They just have this realization come over them at some point. So I'm thinking that the Buddhism is an attempt to bring a person to that moment of awakening.
Yes, and in Buddhism, there's always cultivation prior to the awakening.
This is like an explanation of how to get there, what things to dwell on in your thinking in order to bring you closer to a possibility of realizing the world through an awakened state.
I think they would prefer, for example, in the Heart Sutra, things you have to stop relying on and stop focusing on, things you have to let go of. Because what's preventing that awakening is this buildup of dust on the mere mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be wiped away. So it's those thought coverings, it's those concepts, it's those perceptions. That's what is causing your diluted view of reality. And those have to be removed.
Right.
So that is I think you're absolutely right, that different forms of methodology are applied, particularly in Chan Buddhism, to help individuals remove their individual dust.
Right.
And in some cases, they can be taught something by the master. There's one case where the guy is thrown out of the monastery. The master said, you're useless, you'll never get it. And so the guy says, yeah, I'm useless. And he goes away. And months later, while he's hoeing his field, because he's growing his own food, the sound of the hoe hitting a rock, he has an immediate awakening. But it wouldn't have happened. He stops and he thanks his master, because when the master threw him out and took him away from his book learning, that's when he began to live Zen rather than just study Zen. So we're going to talk about this guy. He's very interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay. So
Other question?
yeah, that's it. Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Bye.
Anyone else? Ooh, gotta stop our recording.